Yep. And just pause one thing here. So today what I'd like to do is pick up with the discussion we started last week about basic Buddhist psychology, or the understanding of how consciousness works. And here's the reason we're doing this. First, we're back in the foundation teachings, and we're trying to, start from the very beginning. It's very hard to pick where to start, right? So this is at the beginning. It might not be the very beginning. And the second thing is, many of my teachers have said, if you want to get somewhere, it helps to know where that is. Like to have a map. I'm here and I want to get there. So I'm literally about 20 kilometers south west of Halifax in a straight line. So if I want to get to Halifax, I have to go roughly northeast. Can't go anywhere in a straight line in Nova Scotia, so that's a general direction rather than sometimes the road's going this way, sometimes it's going that way. But I sort of know Halifax is that way. If I headed out due east, I'd just be going into the ocean. So that's not going to get me to Halifax without a very long journey. So it helps to know where you're going and where you're starting from. So that's part of what we're doing. And it's about the practice and the journey of meditation. So it's helpful to know where meditation goes and what you're starting with. So that's why we're having this discussion about how the mind works and Buddhist psychology and that kind of thing. And it's very easy to get headed off in the wrong direction. So I don't want to say a lot about heading in the wrong direction, but if you start meditating and your goal in meditation is just to have nice thoughts, that's not where this map goes. You might have nice thoughts. You might wind up with more kind thoughts than angry thoughts. That would be the expected result. But that's not where the map points, necessarily. So you see people talking about mindfulness, and it's like, oh, I want it to be less stressful, and I want my mind to settle. And there are all of these possible side effects of meditation that get mistaken for the destination. So I'm going to say that again. It's really easy to mistake the side effects of meditation, like getting calmer, right? With that's what I'm trying to do, get calmer. And if you look at a lot of things about mindfulness or meditation or Buddhism online, it looks like it's all about being calmer. But what if the appropriate response is to get upset? I don't know about you, but if I hear about children being hurt or people being taken advantage of, or I'm reading the things about the changes in the climate, I'm upset. That's an appropriate reaction. It's not the appropriate reaction as the house catches fire to go, I'm just going to stay here and be in my calm, quiet place. No, get the kids, grab your passports, get the documents you need, flee. That's the appropriate response. So where we're headed with this, with meditation, is trying to develop a mind that is clear, awake, that pulls forward the natural compassion of being a human being, the natural goodness of heart. Awake, clear, warm, constantly fresh, right? Just being a human being. That's what we're aiming for. That's our Halifax in this map. That's or wherever you would want to go. That's the destination. So where are we starting from? And, this is it feels a little bit academic, a little bit intellectual to give this talk, but, it really helps to know what you're starting with. You're trying to bake a cake, if I can switch metaphors. You know what a cake looks like, so you're pretty clear on what the goal is. And then you go to your cupboard, and you had in mind a chocolate cake, but you don't have any chocolate cake mix, you don't have any cocoa, you don't have any chocolate chips, you don't have any chocolate. You do have vanilla, you do have lemon, maybe you have something else, maybe you have strawberries. Well, that'll change the cake you make. Right? So knowing what you're starting with is really helpful. And today's talk is about knowing what we're starting with. So I started the question at the very beginning with the question of, you all have an experience of consciousness. And can you share a moment from that, just a snapshot of those? And I'm just going to pick two because they were sort of at the opposite ends of the spectrum of wow and yikes. But they were all good. What was the one? See if I can, going on a walk and seeing two bald eagles mating. That would be a moment of magic perception for me. Like, I was like, wow, right? And the opposite end of the spectrum, that's a moment of consciousness, right? And the opposite end of the spectrum, trying to repair a plumbing problem with your wife or partner, and all of a sudden you're noticing this unwanted upflowing of plumbing problems. You're watching the unwanted fluid come up and out into your zone. Yikes. So perception, what's really happening, and what I want to talk about is, and I'm borrowing this, these descriptions can get very, very ornate, and I'm trying to keep this as simple as I can. And so I'm borrowing from a teaching from I think he died a year or two ago, Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Vietnamese Zen monk. The Tibetan version of this is like twice as many categories. So I like this one because it's shorter, right? And there are four he talks about, and I'll try to send the article to you. He talks about 4 levels of consciousness. So I hope 4 is not too many. And today we're only going to talk about 3, because last week we talked about the first one, the deepest one, the fundamental mistaken perception. I am me. That you have this moment of awareness of feeling separate, right? You recognize that you're conscious and you go, that's me, right? And that moment it happens so often, and it's happened for so long, and it's so taken for granted that you just assume that you are a me, that you own this thing called me. Each of us has our own special me. We are an individual, separate self. And it doesn't matter how many, psychological or philosophical investigations point you at, you're not the same me you were when you went to first grade. There's been a lot of changes in that me since you were just a little girl or a little boy, and you hadn't grown up, you hadn't fallen in love, you hadn't suffered heartbreak, you hadn't gotten married or not married, had kids, not had kids, had a job, not had a job, been fired many times. Like none of that had happened. Lost lovers, had children die, had partners die, had parents die, moved separate houses. The me that you are right now is way different than 6-year-old you. I went to school when I was 6. If you were bright and went at 5, or you went at 7, whenever that was, that first day of school for you, right? So there's a lot of changes, but we still believe in that me. I'm that person. And you need a little bit of that. But I'm going back to my cake recipe. Some cakes call for a pinch of salt. They don't call for a pound of salt. That would make a very bitter cake. But we are constantly throwing the salt in. Oh, I'm me. That's me. I'm me. I'm me. And to say that I am not me, that fundamental mistake, in perception, this was last week's share, seems a bit crazy, but it's actually closer to the truth. I am experiencing awareness. Oh, that's true. I am me. Not so true. So that's the deepest level of consciousness, that fundamental mistake. I'd like to go up to the surface level, right? And I'm going to try and keep these simple, right? Because that's how I remember them, right? If you like them more complex, I'm sure you can find lots of complexity to investigate in the internet akaya, in the internet dharma, right? So the simplest level I would call knowing. And then the next level, sensing. And then the next level, let's call it flowing. It's actually flowing, holding, storing, but let's call it flowing. And this is sort of an explanation of more like a river than a rock. So we've talked so many times in Community Refuge that, life is more like a river than a rock. So now we're taking a closer look at what that all means. Right? And this has a payoff in terms of meditation, because if you know what consciousness is, then it's very useful to know that what you choose to pay attention to has a direct impact or result on your consciousness. Right? Attention actually changes your consciousness. So that's why we meditate. Helpful to know what it is you're trying to change. So on this very surface level, so back again, the surface level is knowing, and then the next deeper one is sensing, and then the one after that we're calling holding for the moment, right? So the knowing level is really all the stuff that you think of, most people think of normally as, when you think of what's my mind, right? We use mind a lot, but mind, it's sort of an interesting word. It sounds like it's one thing. It would actually be more correct to say, what are my minds, my plurals, right? We have many minds. So we're knowing. This is why consciousness is an easier word. We're having thoughts. We're having, physical sensations. We're having memories. We're experiencing emotion. And all of that's happening in the knowing mind. It's sort of that top level of, when we were sitting to do the meditation, a car went by with a very throaty engine. It was sort of and so I was, oh, that's too loud. And I turned off the mic on the Zoom on this end. And so I was having the perception about the sound. I knew it was a car. That's a thought. I saw it going by. That's another thought. I thought about all of you and the noise on the Zoom room. All of those are thoughts. I felt a little bit anxious. Oh, that's too noisy. That's another content of knowing. And then I took a little action to make it better. That's another thing. Right? All of that's happening in the knowing mind. Right? And that takes a lot of energy. So I would like to suggest that, I'm making this number up, so please don't take it as the Dharma, but it's a suggestion that for most of us, 90 to 95% of our consciousness is taken up by knowing, by conscious knowing. Knowing, thinking, feeling, remembering, planning, worrying, bodying. I'm a little bit uncomfortable because it's so humid, or I feel good because there's a breeze coming in, or all of that. That's what's taking up 90 to 95% of our consciousness. And so when you sit to meditate and you start to, on purpose, say, for the moment, I'm just paying attention to breath, you're actually turning down the volume or turning down the energy requirement on knowing. Maybe it becomes 50% of your consciousness, which leaves a lot of spare room for other things to happen. And so we're deliberately focusing to bring our attention to, a concentrated point. And the reason is you might begin to notice the other things that are going on that you never get to pay attention to because you're so busy knowing at this surface level. So I'm going to repeat that. The reason to sort of bring things to a focused point and to practice, shamatha meditation or shine or calm abiding, there's lots of names for it, Zen, mindfulness, right? We're bringing things down to a calm point so we can notice the rest of what's going on as well as the knowing. Right? So that's just the beginning. We get to the middle level, right? So that was the first layer of consciousness, knowing consciousness. You might think of it as minding consciousness, right? Mindings, right? Better to be plural. Right? The second layer are the sense consciousnesses. And I find this very useful for myself. So I hope it's useful to you. And if it's not, you can let it go. It's not important. If it doesn't help you, you can let it go. We take our senses for granted. We don't, at least most of us, I believe, and we don't really think about how they work. But this Buddhist psychology of how consciousness works takes a detailed look at senses, right? So you have, let's just take sight. You have organs of sight, the eyes. You have the ability to see, which is sometimes called sight consciousness or visual consciousness. You have the object of that consciousness, visible forms. Like you can't see invisible things. That's why they're called invisible, right? You also, unless you have the particular unusual wiring of your brain, you can't see sounds. And actually, if you are a synesthete, someone who has sensory experiences that blend, when you see a sound, you're actually producing something that's not there. So if you see an image on the computer, if you hear a sound and you see orange, right? Like you hear the sound of a car and it's orange to you, that's being generated inside of knowing, right? So let's just keep it simple. The ordinary way it works is you have the organ, the eye, you have the object, things that can be seen, visual objects, visual forms, right? You have the field in which that works, the field of what is visible. There is a sound field, a touch field, a smell field. What am I missing? A taste field. Right? So you have an organ of sound, the ears, an organ of touch, the skin, right? An organ of taste, the tongue, an organ for smell, the nose, right? So each of the senses have an organ, an object, and the field in which they work. So that's very interesting that, when you're sitting to meditate, why do we put something in front of us that represents awake mind or openness? So for me, when we meditate together, I'm not looking, even though I love looking at you on the Zoom screen, I turn to look out the window at this beautiful little harbor that I live on because it's more peaceful and settled. I'm choosing the visual object that I'm going to let into my field of visual consciousness. If I closed my eyes, then probably I would hear more and I would be trying to meditate in a quiet place because that has an effect on my consciousness. Right? So we're choosing and working with the contents. So it's just very useful to know that's how consciousness works. There's this knowing level, and it's supported by this level of sense perception, and that's how the senses work. The eyes see visible things. and you recognize them. The ears hear hearable sounds, audible sounds, and you recognize them within the field of hearing, etc. And so much of when I asked for an example of consciousness, many of you went there. So, one was the sense of fragrance on the morning air. It was like I started as I was listening I would write down something and then underline it, like it's fragrance. That's scent consciousness. Or seeing a beautiful, the beautiful garden of a friend, right? Seeing the garden, right? Or uh, looking out the kitchen window and, there's less haze in the air. So another seeing one. Or, feeling the coolness on the legs, like of wind, or, just feeling coolness on your skin, right? That's a touch one, right? So that were just moments of consciousness. So they were really wonderful examples, right? So we're working with um, our knowing level, all our thoughts, feelings, emotions, memories, etc., and we're working with our senses. So I don't know about you, but when I sit to meditate, sometimes the sense consciousnesses call for my attention. So I feel like an ache in my back, or my feel stiffness, or or I just feel good, or I see something, or I hear something, like the car going by in my earlier example. And it's like, okay, that's it. That's not what I'm paying attention to. I'm trying to pay attention to my breath. So I just notice that distracted me, and I bring myself back. So it's again, like, what are we working with? So sense consciousness, knowing consciousness. Let's go down to the third level, right? Which I was calling flowing consciousness. And this is the more like a river, right, than a rock. And this is part of how we get to the mistake, right? That moment by moment, you're having an experience of consciousness. Something happens and you're conscious of it. So I think we've been talking about that as a moment of experience plus awareness. And then the next moment of experience plus awareness. And then the next moment of experience plus awareness. For those of you who did the Meditation is Freedom course with me, those are mental moments or consciousness moments, right? Experience and awareness, experience and awareness, experience and awareness, right? And they flow by like a river. So your consciousness is full in a sort of flowing, ongoing way with experience and your awareness of that. It also, this flow, it's like something going downstream. Well, whatever was put in upstream, this is the holding, right, part of this flowing consciousness. It's floating downstream on the river, right? So if you practice a lot of anger, like if you get angry easily and you're used to being angry and it's your style of reacting to things, and you sort of flare up when you're challenged or you don't know something or it's not the way you want it or whatever would cause your anger, we feel threatened, right? And then, then that anger is flowing downstream. And at this present moment, it's very likely that part of what you will experience has the feel or the aroma or the touch of that anger. We sometimes call that karma, right? That there's a flow of what happened into the past as it affects what's happening now. And so when you sit and meditate, you bring your mind to a concentrated point. You're trying to turn down the volume on the knowing, right? You're focusing the attention, so you're narrowing the field of experience to what you're paying attention to, right? Of the breath going in and out, right? Or whatever you were working with. So that's working with the sensing level. And then you find yourself in this deeper level of flowing consciousness, and you might begin to remember things that happened before and notice them in the depth of your consciousness. Sometimes this is called the storehouse consciousness, which is the holding part. So you might begin to, have memories of old anger or old passions. Oh, if we had only stayed together, remembering an old lover, or thank God we separated, remembering an old lover. It could be either, but you're remembering, right? And you didn't sit down to remember your old lover or that moment where you got hired for the job you wanted or got fired, or that moment where, something turned out just the way you wanted, or that nasty thing that got said to you when you were in first grade, back to being a 6-year-old. Like those things sort of bubble up in your consciousness. It's like they float to the surface of your attention. And it's useful to know that you're working with one of the consciousnesses, this flowing, holding, right? It's holding what's happened in the past, right? And it's stored there. So I like to think of it as flowing, holding, storing. And if I just want one word, I go for flowing, right? It's holding. Sometimes this is called the storehouse consciousness or the alaya consciousness. It's just those things are there until you work on them. So what I'm about to say is a metaphor. It's a picture description. It's not actually reality. So this is helping to understand. It's like this deep consciousness is like a storehouse. And all the unprocessed things that have happened in your past, this life and many lifetimes before, are held in this storehouse as it flows by moment by moment by moment by moment by moment. The Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh calls it a museum. It's like things in the museum, the Brian Museum, going by bit by bit by bit. And you remember, right? And then you have a chance to bring it as a moment of conscious experience and let it go. Now, here's an example that happens in meditation a lot, right? You might remember, going back to this is a very easy example to work with. You could fill it in with another emotion, but I'm going to choose anger. Something happened to you in the past, and the result is you felt angry. So maybe you got hurt by somebody. And we're not arguing whether they did it or didn't, or, it's just you feel hurt. And that moment of hurt bubbles up and you feel your anger at being hurt. Most often, when anger bubbles up and we give into it, we plant it's like we put the next object into the museum, the next moment of hurt. We react to it by getting angry and, it shouldn't have happened, right? And then that goes back into the storehouse to flow downriver. But when you're meditating, you have a moment where you can let it go. And here's how letting go happens. The moment of anger comes up. Without trying to resist it and go, I'm not angry. Yes, you are. Let's be honest, right? Or that's not anger, right? That's denial, right? So it's just being honest, right? That's anger, and I let it go. Bring my attention back to the breath. I'm not responding to it with anger or fear or aggression. I'm just recognizing it as an object in the museum that doesn't need to be in the Brian Museum anymore. Thank you. Back to the breath. Right? And you're working with deep consciousness. The more you work with letting go of difficult objects and filling your mind or your consciousness with compassion, awareness, adaptability, calm response, then you gradually shift from what is called samsara or confusion to awake mind. So lots more to say about that. We're sort of close to the end of what I wanted to share today, of the usefulness of knowing about these 4 levels of consciousness. From the top, the knowing consciousness, just ordinary what's happening in our heads and our awareness. The sense consciousness, which we often take for granted, but it's going on. The storehouse consciousness, which I've been calling flowing, right? The flowing by, right? consciousness of moment by moment, right? And then that very deep mistake of that's me. So imagine the liberation you could feel, because this is about transformation, of you've been sitting, you've been working at that very deep level of storehouse consciousness or flowing consciousness. The next moment of anger flows up and you feel like that's me. I was hurt. And you're holding on to that experience of awareness. It proves I'm here. If I wasn't here, that couldn't, and you let go. I don't have to be angry about that thing that happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago or even 20 minutes ago, right? Unless it's useful. And quite honestly, 99.99% of the time, it's not useful. It's reinforcing the fundamental mistake. And so you recognize it, you go, okay, back to the breath. So I hope some of that is useful for your meditation practice. And it's sort of a why we're doing the meditation practice. We're not doing it to be holy. We're doing it because bringing our attention to a focused awareness allows us to work with the deep levels of entrapment in our mind and to approach freedom and transformation. And so with that, I'm going to pause the recording. If I can hit the pause button. There we go.